Welcome back. Today I'm continuing my discussion of the book of Acts in relation to the trilemma argument for the resurrection. This is the trilemma for the disciples, that either they were lying, or they were mistaken, or Jesus really rose from the dead. What they were saying was true. And so, as I've often said, the content of what they testified to shows that they could not have been merely mistaken. It's not the kind of thing you can just be mistaken about. The context shows that they were not lying. And that leaves the option that what they were saying was true and Jesus had really risen from the dead. So the question I'm addressing in this series concerns a claim that has been made by some skeptics that even if you grant Acts as just a report of the origins of Christianity in the early days of Christianity, even if you take it at face value, it does not support the trilemma in the sense of supporting the claim that a specific group of people, named people, there were at least 12 of them, were out there risking their lives for this message that Jesus was risen from the dead. Bart Ehrman has said that. Apologia, the YouTube skeptic, has said that even if we take Acts at face value, which then they'll say, we don't really take Acts at face value, but even if you did, it doesn't support this. So I'm responding to that by saying, okay, if we take Acts at face value, what does it in fact support? So arguments about the reliability of Acts would be made elsewhere. I want to start right from the beginning of Acts. I'm going to talk about Acts 1 and 2 in relation to the question of whether these named individuals existed, were listed, and were out there risking their lives. Now, right at the beginning of Acts 1, it's emphasizing Jesus showing himself to the disciples for 40 days, which could be like a round number, around 6 weeks' time. It ends up being. It refers to the apostles whom he had chosen in Acts 1, verse 2. And of course, there's going to be talk about the breadth of the meaning of the term apostle, but the context here really interprets it. To these, he presented himself alive by many convincing proofs. Okay. And so then Jesus is having a conversation with them. And in verse 8, he says, "You shall be my witnesses both in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria, and even to the remotest part of the earth." Now, I think Jesus really said that, and I'm sure that the author thought he really said that. The point here is the emphasis upon them as his witnesses, these apostles whom he had chosen. Now, this is really interesting because then it narrates the ascension, which for the moment I'm not talking about. That's not the point, but it's a scene. It's all the same scene, all right? And verse 12 says, "Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey away. And when they had entered, they went up to the upper room where they were staying. That is, Peter and John and James and Andrew." And I'm not going to give the whole list, but verse 13, 113, actually lists 11 names. And it's saying that these were among the people to whom Jesus was saying, "You're going to be my witnesses." Okay, and they come back, and then they're talking among themselves and so forth. So this list is the same one that's given in the book of Luke, which makes sense because it's written by the same author, except for Judas Iscariot, of course, who's already dead. All right, so that list of the 11 gets overlooked sometimes in these discussions, but it links what's come before, Jesus saying that they'll be his witnesses, with what comes immediately after in chapter 2, which is they're actually going out and being his witnesses. But there's more that makes this even more explicit. They're all up there and they're praying and so forth, and beginning in verse 15, Peter stands up and says, we need to elect another core apostle. Okay? When I say core apostle, I mean someone to complete the number of the 12. They evidently thought that Jesus had chosen 12 for a reason, that the number 12 is important. And so since now Judas Iscariot's betrayed Jesus, he's bad and he's dead, they need to elect another one. And Peter really emphasizes this. And it says explicitly, verse 21, it is therefore necessary that of the men who have accompanied us all the time that the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning with the baptism of John until the day that he was taken up from us, one of these should become a witness with us of his resurrection. Now, who's the us? It's the 11, right? Become a witness with us to take the place of Judas Iscariot to fill up the number to 12. We've just been given 11 names. Now we're going to find out whom they elected to be the 12th name. That was important to them. And what was the job description? To be a witness with us of Jesus' resurrection. It could not be more explicit. The early church had this core group at the very beginning, in those earliest days, that was governing them. And their claim to be that core ruling, governing group was that they were the apostles in this narrower sense who had been chosen to be especially witnesses of Jesus' resurrection. It's just could not be clearer. So they put forward two possibilities who fulfill this job description or fulfill this description of having been with them the whole time and apparently are willing to be among the 12. Joseph Barsabbas, also called Justus, and Matthias, and they pray, and then they do some kind of randomizing process, and Matthias is chosen. It says in verse 26, and they drew lots for them, and the lot fell to Matthias, and he was numbered with the 11 apostles. And, how much clearer can it be that here the word apostles being used in this narrow sense to refer to these 11 men, then plus Matthias, and they're going to go out there and be witnesses to Jesus' resurrection. Okay, now we come to chapter 2, and you get the narration of the coming of the Holy Spirit. Again, I'm not here talking about what was the nature of the tongues miracle, what was the nature of the little appearance of fire on their heads, or any of that. What I'm trying to do is to talk about their being willing to risk their lives, and there being this specific group of people whose names we know, who were willing to risk their lives for the message that Jesus was physically risen from the dead, which, again, his physical resurrection has been emphasized right in the very first verses, that he showed them by many convincing proofs. And that fits with the Gospel of Luke, by the same author, sent to the same immediate recipient, Theophilus, where Jesus shows them his scars, he eats with them, and so forth. Okay. So after all of this, they start somehow speaking in other languages or being heard in a variety of languages. And there's this loud noise like a wind, and so people come running, and now they're apparently outside, and they're talking to all these people. Now, I'm not claiming that the only people who spoke here were the 12, but I am certainly claiming that they were among the people who spoke. And the people are perplexed and saying, we hear them in our own tongues speaking of the mighty deeds of God. Acts 2:11. All right, and then some say they're drunk. All right, now look at this. Acts 2:14, but Peter, taking his stand with the 11, raised his voice and declared to them, men of Judea, and all you who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you and give heed to my words. These men are not drunk, and so forth. And then he gives this sermon. Now, literally, the other 11, including Matthias, who has been recently elected, are standing with him. Now, it would be quite ridiculous to say, well, they're not preaching because Peter is acting as spokesman. what would be the alternative? We've already been told that they're standing around speaking in to the people, like in smaller groups, okay? But now it's going to be, everybody get quiet, and Peter's going to raise his voice and give a sermon. Of course, they're not all going to do it in chorus or something, but they do the next best thing. They literally are standing up there with him, okay, endorsing what he is saying. It really doesn't get much clearer than that they are, these 12 guys are the central core group of 12 guys who are out there giving this message and giving it in public. One of the silly things that has kicked off this series of mine is the statement that Bart Ehrman made in a dialogue with my husband on the Unbelievable show several years ago, where he said, well, even if you take Acts at face value, they're not out there on street corners. They're talking to their family and friends. Now, this has it exactly backwards. There is no narration here of they're talking to family and friends. I'm not denying that they talked to their families and friends and told them things that they remembered from Jesus' ministry. But the point is, that's not the emphasis here at all. If we want to talk about what Acts narrates at face value, it's they're speaking in public. They're being out there in public and trying to get that message out as loudly as possible to as many people as possible who do not already know it and who are, by and large, strangers to the 12 who are standing up there. So if we want to talk about what Acts shows, what Acts narrates, it's not them sitting around with a little group and saying, now children, gather around, listen to this nice sweet story I have to tell you about Jesus. It's about them being out there and saying, hey, everybody, okay, Jesus rose from the dead. And more than that, Peter is very controversial and confrontational. He says, he was a man attested, this is verse 22, delivered up by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. And God raised him up again, putting an end to the agony of death, since it was impossible for him to be held in its power. I mean, he's out there like shaking his head. He's accusing sort of a group. And of course he says, as you yourselves know, so it's assuming that some of these people are acquainted with this Jesus ministry, Jesus crucifixion. The same group of religious leaders is in power at that time. This is only about 6 weeks after Jesus' crucifixion. So the people who were out there and were like, crucify him, and putting him to death at the hands of godless men, in other words, inducing the Gentile ruler Pilate to crucify Jesus, those guys are still in power. Peter knows that they will hear what he is saying. I mean, that he'd be stupid not to know. It's this big public event here where he's speaking loudly to thousands of people, evidently, and just putting it out there that Jesus was unjustly slain. Okay, and then the crowd certainly understands that it's this group standing up here that is attesting to this. So in verse 37, now when they heard this, they were pierced to the heart and said to Peter and the rest of the apostles, brethren, what shall we do? All right. So remember, 126, Matthias was numbered with the 11 apostles. 2:14, taking his stand with the 11. 2:37, they said to Peter and the rest of the apostles, brethren, what shall we do? They know that this group here is the group that is endorsing this message, this very controversial message, and it's a challenge to them that they need to repent and believe on Jesus, which is what, Peter says in response. I really want it to be vivid that this is risking their lives already. I'll continue to talk as the book Facts goes on about the rather silly claim that except for Peter and John, the rest of them only continued advocating this message until they were first told to stop. Not true. Just like Bart Ehrman's misrepresentation, they're not out there on street corners. They're telling stories to their family and friends. No, like exactly the opposite. They are out there on the streets. As Tim said, the only question is whether it was a corner, if you take the narrative of Acts at face value. Think for a minute, try to imagine vividly that you're part of a group of shared ideas and there's a leader among you, and that he is taken and arrested and killed in some kind of horrific way. Not even just lynched, but killed with the official agreement of various officials in charge. And then only 6 weeks pass. The same officials are still in charge. Just like here, Caiaphas is still high priest, the Sanhedrin is still the same Sanhedrin, and Pilate is still the governor. All right? And imagine yourself being asked to stand up out there with a bullhorn in front of a huge group of thousands of people and say, my friend was unjustly killed, and some of you here today are guilty of this, and the rulers killed him, and they were guilty, okay? And this is terrible. Join our movement. And loudly out there proclaiming it. Would you be risking your own life? Could the same process by which your friend, who was the leader previously, was put to death, be carried out against you under those circumstances? Of course. Peter and the rest of the 12, the other 11, including Matthias, we don't have any reason to think that they had any more protection than Jesus had from being captured and taken off. And Pilate, comes out, what is it now? Oh, these guys are, now they're trying to start this whole movement. They're carrying it on. They're continuing to deceive and mislead the people. They're insurrectionists, just like what they said about Jesus. You need to kill them too. And, what reason do they have to think that Pilate's going to say, no, not this time? Now, I'm not saying that actually happened right there and then. Later, in one of the later chapters of Acts, James, the son of Zebedee, is executed by the sword by Herod, and he has the authority to do that. Stephen, and I don't know if Stephen was a witness of Jesus' resurrection. He was a deacon. He wasn't one of the 12. He's lynched in the sense of being stoned by a mob, and, that could happen to others. There are countries today where Christians can just be dragged out and killed, and the authorities are like, I see nothing. They nothing happens about it. So there were all kinds of risks that they were taking, and they had to know that. Just as you would have to know that in the imaginary situation I just put forward, they would be stupid not to know that they're putting themselves in a very risky position by putting themselves out there so soon after Jesus' crucifixion for the message. Not only they're going to continue to blame people for having him crucified unjustly, but that he rose again, that God endorsed him by raising him from the dead. That's a very controversial message. So, yes, I will talk in later videos about his disciples, about the 12 continuing to do this, maintaining their steadfastness in the face of actual warnings and actual persecution, and that's valuable epistemically. But let's not miss these first 2 chapters in the fact that right there, they're supporting the Trilemma. And I think sometimes, that election of Matthias, people get kind of sidetracked on how did Judas die? And they miss that the more important part of that from a Christian perspective for, in terms of the argument for the truth of Christianity is not whether there's some kind of contradiction about how Judas died, but is the clarity with which the early church is establishing itself on the basis of these 12 men. Okay, that there need to be these 12 men who are witnesses of Jesus' resurrection. It's very evidentialist and it's very specific. We want there to be specific named people who are here, who are qualified to speak and who are willing to speak. I'm not saying that the question of how Judas died is irresolvable. I'm just saying it's kind of misleading in a sense to have that be our focus, our whole focus of discussion concerning Acts 1 instead of the evidential meaning of the election of Matthias and the reason why they did that. So that's for today. How does Acts support the trilemma? If you take it at face value, it does so right from the outset. Come back next time and we'll talk about some other portions of Acts. Thanks for watching. I'm Lydia McGrew.